Some of these questions are going to be based around the topic of best types of reps for athletes, which I think is very applicable. Almost all of their strength work is going to be mobility based, recovery from their training, and then optimizing their power output as far as, relative strength focus and minimal hypertrophic lift training. I think stability is probably the big factor. And when you have that stability, you just have better power output. Joey's asking if we put the garage grips, on the bench bar, right? Is that going to function the same way? And I will tell you in multiple different facets. One, if you throw these on dumbbells, it feels as though you're adding 10 pounds to the dumbbells. When you take them off, it feels like you remove 10 to 15 pounds. Like you immediately feel like a little bit more, like way more control, way more stable. I think stability is probably the big factor. And when you have that stability, you just have better power output, because you're quieting the noise in that area. So I 100% believe you throw this on a bench bar, you will definitely notice it's much more challenging. I also believe if you make it like a little bit more like a closer grip, it's even crazier for getting that big time pump in your triceps. So I would say without a doubt, you throw garage grips on, you're going to feel it immediately. And I think that it's going to be better on the dumbbell bench, but it's going to be even there's something about with like that narrow grip, and especially when you're doing like a close grip incline, it just destroys you. So in comparison to the bars that we use, we got a 2.5 inch bar, we got a 2 inch bar. At one time, we actually had a 3 inch bar, which I thought was actually overkill. I think it was like the point of diminishing returns was well surpassed, so we don't use that at all. We also even had a cubed bar at one point as well, which ended up being a massive failure. So, yes, that would be my answer. Garage grips will suffice as far as adding that to the bar for you to increase motor unit recruitment. Now, getting back to Keist. Keist had a great comment, a great question that I wanted to address. That was, there's a lot of talk about partial reps, specifically in the bodybuilding world, okay? Bodybuilding fitness world. What is the science on this, and how does that translate into athletic performance? So sadly, as far as like partial reps, and this is me defining this for Keist. So if we looked at partial reps specifically as doing partial range of motion, but I would argue not even doing like a 90-degree squat, but actually doing it to like a pin or to a box. I think that's where we've got to sort of clarify, is that if we would do a back squat to a box, or a back squat down to a pin or down to a rack and then held that there and drove up, that would be a partial range of motion. I would even say too, maybe if you guys watched the chest video that we just put out, where it was at the end of the video, me focusing on press, explode into the pins, come back down, explode into the pins. Okay. So that would be another partial rep discussion. I also would say partial rep discussion could be based around doing dips and not fully locking out, doing presses, not fully locking out, doing pull-ups, not fully locking out. And I would even argue that when you do an exercise like a rope climb, you usually don't do that through that full range of motion. So how does that translate into athletic performance? My answer would be, first, going back to the science aspect, from my personal research and what I've looked through, there's not a ton of research on those specific partials coming off of pins, coming off of a rack. Dr. B, the Olympic champion that I trained under, does actually have, and actually I just saw somebody just commented, Dr. B, favorite episode, I'm not sure, but more. Oh, this is from Harry. More time on my time spending with Dr. B. So Dr. B actually has a paper where he used partial reps for post-tetanic potentiation, post-activation potentiation, whatever you want to call it, where he had athletes pull into an immovable object, and they pulled into this, and they would hold that for 7 to 10 seconds isometrically, pull in, squeeze, hold. Then they remove these pins, and then they do power cleans, and they were measuring their power output and how rapidly they were developing power versus not doing that partial rep first and not having that potentiation. So they would see that in an acute setting, the potentiation set did indeed work, and they would move the bar faster, and they would also get greater motor unit recruitment. So Keast is actually going back to, say, lengthening partials, deep squat and only going halfway up, coming back down, halfway back up. Okay, so answering this, there's a very small amount from what I've seen of research on what that would look like. Okay, so what happens if you do, a deep bench here, come back up, and you just down there? Now, what I think is happening, what I believe would be happening, is that you're achieving a stretch shortening cycle very rapidly every single time that occurs. So, and Christian Thibodeau, I feel like, has an entire book around this. I should look and see on my shelves. If you would look up, what book would it be? High threshold muscle building. I actually think he goes into this a little bit. And I believe, okay, so Christian Thibodeau does talk about sort of like that stretch shortening cycle a little bit, and I think it is in High Threshold Muscle Building, his book on that. And I believe that one of the benefits behind like a pad bench is that that's actually what's happening, is like there's such a rapid rate of lengthening that's occurring when you're doing a pad bench, and as you're lowering that it forces a greater neural reaction. So you're starting to recruit more, because the mechanical tension would be a little bit higher. The mechanical load could, in theory, be a little bit higher. Now, the problem on those lengthening movements, and if you're thinking about doing like a back squat where you do back up to about 90 degrees, squat back down, you're never locking out. There's, in my opinion, or in my research, there's not a lot of evidence around it. There's not a lot of research on it. I would be interested to see, because of the stretch shortening cycle, the bounce, okay, because of the bounce, and also because you're under constant tension, you're never locking out, what actually happens at that mid-range. Like, do you actually increase your strength at that mid-range? And then also what happens out of the bottom position? And at what point does that have like some type of diminishing return? So that would be my answer to that question for Keast. There's a lot of like old school bodybuilding where bodybuilders would purposely not lock out. And Bill Pearl's book right here, and this book right here, he actually even talks about that. So in his Keys to the Inner Universe, like, he does mention not locking out. That's like one ironic part about people making fun of me for not being able to lock out my right elbow, is that a lot of bodybuilders will not lock out because it leads to greater time under tension, which ideally will lead to just constant mechanical load. Now, I do think there is also a point to pausing at the lockout and holding that there, but that would lead to a different adaptation. So how does that translate into athletic performance? This is going back to the original question from Keast, which we have up on the screen on YouTube right here. Okay. So if you're wondering about the answer to this in regards to athletic performance, I think it's going to be twofold. I think there is going to be some type of specificity. So if you're a wrestler or you're an offensive lineman who has to play at a much lower hip level, or you need to change your level rapidly, like a D lineman, an offensive lineman, and a wrestler, then that full range of motion is going to help. I also think when you have younger athletes and they're really stiff in a bad way, through that full range of motion, it can help with mobility, which in turn is going to lead to a little bit better recruitment. I would say, because full range of motion back squats have been shown to increase speed and vertical jump, I would in theory say that could happen as long as there's not a ton of neural fatigue, like it's not a ton of like super high rep sets. So I would use that. Harry Potter just asked a good question about if athletes then should train to failure. I think that depends. I want to go into that a little bit further because I think that's a really good question. Should football players also have an explosive upper body? This is for soccer players in the U.S., football in Europe. Yes, they should. Okay, so I think that's a good discussion around what Keast said. Sorry, I just cut myself off there. I think that I would argue that I would love to see more research. And if anybody has research on partials that are at the lengthened position, I would want to see it, especially with the upper body. I think the upper body is where you're going to see a little bit greater recruitment or greater turnover. You know, we've talked about doing double bounce front squats, double bounce back squats, and how that transfers quite a bit. I think it improves your positioning out of the bottom. Now, doing that over multiple reps, over multiple sets could be fatiguing and potentially dangerous if you're pathetically weak in those positions, you know. So we also have to keep that in mind. So Donnie McMee, who is on the screen right now, right here, Donnie is asking, since people are asking for sports-specific training, have you done one? And I'm not going to use this word. This word right here is not getting used right there. I'm going to use the word table tennis. So Donnie McMee, you know, a lot of people have asked us, can you do a strength training video on sword battles? Can you do a strength training video on alpine skiing? Can you do a strength training video on, in this case for Donnie, table tennis? Can you do a strength training video on, you know, you guys can, maybe that could be another crazy vote, is that we just have like 4, you know, obscure slash, I mean, like one, I wanted to do a strength training on pickleball going back like probably 4 or 5 months, and we never did it because it ended up being like, all right, well, that's stupid. Oh, Frank just posted, do you program Romanian rhythm squats for your athletes? I don't know what those are. Is that like the Javorek squats, like the sets of 50 with just like different angles? I feel like that's what those are, the Javorek squats. We do program Romanian rhythmic Romanian deadlifts for our weightlifters though. How many less calories should you eat with a cut? Try start at 200 to 400 calories after a bulk. Cut 200 to 400 calories, see what happens. Okay, so getting back to Donnie's question, is that we could do one on table tennis. I think it would be phenomenal because I think most of table tennis work should really be around the trunk, and it should really be around the leg strength. I think, dude, I would train a table tennis player probably in a very similar method of training somebody like in parkour or somebody in free running. And that could be, you know, another strength training for, right? Now, going into, I love grippers, by the way. I love grippers for grip strength. I do think they're pretty effective. So the next one for that obscure strength training, that specific sports specific strength training, it would be something like Nordic skiing or alpine skiing. I think it was alpine skiing would be another one. I think the big aspect that we've all got to remember when we're talking about specific base training is that in most cases, if we're thinking about specificity, 70 to 75% of your program's still going to be pretty similar, right? I think where you're going to see like specific changes or alterations would be in the warm-ups. It would be in accessories, and probably a little bit of athlete day based off of your jumps. I also think that most of what would come out of it as well would be an alteration in those rep styles. I think that would happen, you know, in intensity. I think like the actual exercises wouldn't change very much. I think it would much more be focused on what you would actually be doing in your warm-ups and then the load. I think that's where you're going to see quite a bit of difference. And I think like the joint angles, you know, one thing too is like we actually filmed a recent video. Well, we just put out that video on plyometrics yesterday. I hope you guys liked that. I hope you guys saw that. We got to vote. So we actually do have a new poll here. We got table tennis. I think if I can, let me see if I can click on this. I can't. It's weird for me to expand this. Okay, so the poll right now is table tennis, medieval sword fighting, pickleball, or archery. And we only have 7 votes. So you guys gotta get in and vote on this. We got 8 votes. I don't want to sway this too much, but I'd love a table tennis pickleball video. I'd love to do that. I wish we could go a little bit longer on that vote. Maybe like can we extend the polls to make them longer than like 5 minutes? Yeah, a couple people have asked for that medieval sword fighting, which I thought was fantastic. Anyway, going back to it, I think it's like really the rep styles would change based off of that. So if I would be working, you know, and I would, let's talk about how the marathon the world record was just broken in the marathon by Kenyan, Kelvin Kiptum. Okay. Look at this sweet Kenya bracelet I got from the Kenyan sprint coach. So Kelvin Kiptum just broke the world record, which was previously held by Eliud Kipchoge. He did it in 2 hours and 35 seconds. What would I be focusing on? If I'm looking at Kelvin Kiptum, first I want to focus on, is it open skilled, closed skilled? Ironically, that's a tough discussion with the marathon. I would call it open skilled, even though you're just in the same pattern of locomotion. There are cases where you have hills and things like that, wind and those other factors. So arguably, it could be an open skilled sport. The next big factor would be, what are the joint angles that you're dealing with? Finally, the next big factor is, what are the energy systems being used? And if you were in our virtual Strength Coaches Summit, I talked about this a little bit. I touched on some of these things. So in this case, with a marathon, right, you're looking at joint angles are basically quarter squat, and then we're looking at energy system as classic endurance. It's super, super aerobic. But we also know that if we develop some speed, if we're doing 100s, 200s, even 800s, we can increase our power output, which in turn will likely lead to a higher cadence, a faster cadence over that marathon time frame. So if we're developing classical endurance and we're developing strength and power output, we're going to likely run a faster marathon. So in comparison with sport specificity, in comparison to, let's say, a football player, this individual who's a football player has to gain weight. First of all, they have to get faster. They have to focus on absolute strength much more than the marathoner, who we don't really want to gain any weight at all. We want them to be as reactive as possible. We want them to be extremely explosive, but we also want them to be able to hold that with that classic endurance. So almost all of their strength work is going to be mobility-based, recovery from their training, and then optimizing their power output as far as, relative strength focus and minimal hypertrophic lift training, minimal hypertrophic training. Whereas, so the volume's going to be pretty freaking low, but they're still going to get some resistance-based training to try and improve that cadence, to try and improve that overall speed. Whereas that offensive lineman or defensive lineman, relative to the marathoner, now we've got to do that a little bit longer. Like, we've got to develop that athlete's bulk. We got to develop their muscular size, train with more volume to elicit hypertrophic response while also increasing their overall power output. So I think that's some of the key aspects around that. And I would bring up a recent paper that basically broke down that the more you increase volume, the more muscle mass you'll build. And I actually have that saved, so I might bring it up on my effects of different weekly set progressions on muscular adaptations in trained males. Is there a dose response effect? So is there a dose response effect? Yes, there is indeed a dose response effect through volume. Okay. So if we increase volume, we will see bigger muscles. So the marathoner versus the football player, the sport specificity that lever can be turned down or turned up just based off of increasing volume. Okay. So that's some of the big factors that we've got to bring in when we're thinking about sport specific training. And this is just going into strength training for table tennis, strength training for pickleball, is that a lot of it's going to come down to optimizing the joint angle, optimizing the rate of coordination for those specific exercise or those specific sports. And then finally, it's going to still be the same exact exercises 75% of the time across the board. Is there any clear splits, a leg split, an upper body split, or hitting muscle groups X number of times per week that you recommend or that you've seen within the research?
I actually favor full body workouts for most people.
Because they're just learning how to move with the intent to move things faster. Is there anything to that, or is that still just voodoo from me wanting to get people to do weightlifting movements more?
It maximizes muscle